as we're here in the fourth session. It's so nice. I feel like we've really gotten to know each other over this time. But again, I'm Kate Menken. I'm one of the co-principal investigators of the NYSIEB project. As Nelson framed it, my role this morning, I'm co-presenting with Laura Shensi Moreno, and I feel like what we're doing, I'm going to be giving the macro picture, the big picture, because we know what you're part of. I want you to be critical consumers of the assessment craziness, the testing madness that is surrounding us. And we need to be honest and talk about that. And then at the same time, what Laura's work does is really think about how do we then use the assessment data that we have as strategically as possible to inform instruction, to inform programming for emergent bilingual students. But yes, I want to clarify that what we're promoting in these seminars does not go against what we know are your very real needs for your students to perform well within this context. So let's first talk about what this context is. I have named this talk "No Child Left Bilingual," building on the bilingual advantage of the testing era. Okay? Not incompatible. I think it's important to understand what language education policy is. These are, according to Spolsky, all of the language practices, beliefs, and management of a community or polity. So this can include anything like what language will be the medium, or languages will be the medium of instruction in school, as well as what's going to be the official language of a country, right? And these policies both reflect and influence wider societal and cultural ideologies and attitudes. So this is very, very powerful and important work. Language policies often expose issues of power and marginalization in educational contexts. So I've kind of come to think about U.S., the language education policy in the U.S. Like a pendulum. We have swung back and forth between periods of relative tolerance, where we've been somewhat tolerant of the languages that are being spoken by people within the U.S. other than English, and in periods of time where we have really restricted those languages. Any guess about where we are right now? This is very much a restrictive period. These restrictive periods have always come at times when we have experienced rapid immigration rates, that schools and officials within government systems have felt the need to clamp down on languages other than English. However, we have had periods of more relative tolerance. For example, during the Civil Rights era, the passage of what was then called the Bilingual Education Act, we saw some, we've never supported languages other than English. However, we have, in U.S. policy has been somewhat more tolerant in these other periods. So, for example, in the Civil Rights era, with the passage of Bilingual Education Act, there was a real recognition that if you were not meeting the needs of emergent bilinguals in school, you were barring them access to the educational equity. Right? And so, I think we need to acknowledge where we are right now. These are tough times. Bilingual education in New York is being greatly impacted by all of the language education policies adopted across the U.S. And here are some key policies I want to point out. They're the anti-bilingual education mandates. Maybe everyone here doesn't know this, but the states of California, Arizona, and Massachusetts have passed ballot initiatives that do not permit the use of bilingual education in schools within those states. Massachusetts is the only one. They allow some dual language bilingual education to occur. However, nationally there has been a dramatic loss of bilingual education programs. And you cannot look at this, I feel, independently of the rates of rapid immigration and the politics that are swirling around us. In addition to that, I find it not coincidental that No Child Left Behind has been passed into law. This is highly invasive federal education policy. It's the most invasive federal education policy that we've ever had in the U.S., the one that most greatly impacts the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, right? We know this, you know it inside and out, but I think it can't hurt to repeat what No Child Left Behind requires which is that it requires academic content assessments in English as well as English language proficiency assessments, with consequences both for emergent bilinguals and for their schools. And this results in increasing instruction in English to prepare students for the tests. Students in their schools are disproportionately penalized for failing, right? So if you are a school serving disproportionately large numbers of emergent bilingual students, you are more likely, far more likely, to fail to meet the requirements of No Child Left Behind. So let's put it out there.
There are multiple subgroups.
We also have Race to the Top, which is the Obama administration's first sort of indication to us of where things might be going. They are not looking any different in the sense that Race to the Top advocates the same test and punish approach of No Child Left Behind. In 2010, the Obama administration provided funding to selected states through this grant competition program. New York is one of the 12 states that were awarded this funding. And in order to receive the funding, the states needed to show evidence of advancing standards and assessments, read testing, systems for gathering and analyzing data to measure student progress, testing, teacher effectiveness, which we're now measuring by
Testing.
improving failing schools. We're determining failing schools by
Testing.
all tantamount to more testing. So if anyone had great hopes for the Obama administration that they would really see things differently than the Bush administration had, I'm sorry to tell you that I don't see that happening. So this is with us for now. But we need to recognize also the politics of the current accountability structures that you are all working within. Emergent bilinguals have received negative attention for poor performance on tests in New York as elsewhere. Emergent bilinguals have the lowest graduation rates and highest dropout rates of all students. This is particularly true in those states in the U.S. that require high school exit exams, like New York does with the Regents, that you have to pass exams to graduate. But you have to be critical consumers. We have to note the political nature of this quote-unquote achievement gap, in that language proficiency is what mediates test performance for emergent bilinguals. So what it means to me, for example, when an emergent bilingual student who has been in the U.S. for 2 years fails, quote-unquote, the English language arts exam, even though that student has maybe gone from a 2 to a 3 or for the Regents a 23 to a 46, that does not mean that this child is failing to acquire English, to add English to their linguistic repertoire. Instead, it merely reinforces the reality that they are indeed emergent bilinguals. So, for example, in New York City, as a case in point, the mayor and former schools chancellor, Bloomberg and Klein, have aggressively promoted testing, closed failing schools, and publicized test scores to evaluate schools. And even just last month, we know the teacher evaluations were published and disseminated through the media. The quote-unquote worst teacher in New York City is what? And teacher of English as a second language? In Queens. Okay, so in New York, schools in New York failing to make AYP, adequate yearly progress, for 2 years or more risk closure, as indicated by their placement on the list of schools in need of improvement. CUNY is always, like the sinner schools. And I like to know that all of us are sinners here. Because we know that all of you are here because your schools have been now placed on this list because of the performance of your emergent bilinguals. I think we can learn a lot from that. I'm very happy that you're here. It has brought you here so we can all learn together. But at the same time, I want to be honest and say that I'm critical of those definitions. Of the 1,356 schools that are currently on that CUNY list in the state, 31% or 420 are on that list because of the performance of their emergent bilinguals, because their emergent bilinguals fail to make adequate yearly progress. But given that emergent bilinguals only comprise 8% of the state's entire student population, these schools, are disproportionately being penalized within the current accountability system. I also want to just point out that many places like New York City have added pressures. So they added pressures in New York City. The city report cards assign a letter grade to schools based on student progress, testing, student performance, testing, and school environment, which is not. At the same time, New York is a very complicated and interesting place because historically we have had state policies that are relatively tolerant, again, on paper. We've had the Espira consent decree since 1974, established the right of emergent bilinguals in the city to receive a bilingual education. We have Part 154 at the state level, which then incorporated Espira. And not only does it outline how to identify emergent bilinguals and the data that has to be gathered about them, it also defines services that have to be provided to them. So it upholds Espira when it says that each school district which has an enrollment of 20 or more pupils with quote-unquote limited English proficiency of the same grade level assigned to a building, all of whom have the same native language which is other than English, shall provide such pupils with bilingual education programs. However, one of the things that we're finding is that even with these laws here on paper, in fact, the pressures of accountability outweigh these more tolerant language policies. We find that extremely unfortunate because rather than regarding building upon the students' home languages as a problem and the cause for problem, we actually feel that it is most likely part of the solution. So let's talk about some of the linguistic complexity of the tests used under NCLB. The exams are indeed linguistically complicated, making it very, very difficult to divorce language fully from content. So, for example, I did a word frequency analysis of state English and math regions, and that revealed that even academic content tests like math, science, social studies especially, are linguistically complex, using words likely unknown by an emergent bilingual, which clarifies why testing poses a unique challenge for this student population. And not surprisingly, emergent bilinguals typically score far below other students. There are 4 different kinds of testing accommodations that are permitted nationally. Timing, which is when the test is administered. So, for example, emergent bilinguals are permitted extra time in certain states. Setting, you can go take the test in a small group environment. Presentation, perhaps this is in a language other than English. Perhaps it's orally, perhaps in writing. And then in response, you can, on some exams, in a small minority of states, you may respond in a language other than English. I'm a big believer in experiential learning, so it's test time. Any Hungarian speakers in the room? 1. Okay, don't cheat. Don't help. Okay?
Where is it?
Do you want to help me hand out the test? Let them squirm for a little while. All right, here are your directions. Clear away your papers. No, you don't actually have to, but no use of electronic devices. Yes, I love your help. Thank you. Directions, no talking, or else you will fail. You may not turn the page until I say so. Hold it with page 1 in front of you. Staple on the top left corner. Your whole building. We're going to put that in the paper. All the state. That's where it's so much trouble. Please look at page 1. No talking. They're coming. If we have more than 100 people in the room, we'll need to share, but Nelson's coming around. And what's your name, my Hungarian speaker in the room? Kara's handing them around. Thank you very much. Do you want to?